Good morning, good morning. This is the Caffeinated Bible. My name is David Paris, and today we're looking at the parables, specifically the 5 types of parables that we find within the Gospel. Right now I'm in the middle of a series on the parables, and so if you haven't seen any of those or picked them up yet, I'll put a link up over here. You can click on them and I'll take you to a playlist on the parables. Today we're looking at the 5 types of parables and why that's significant to help you dive deeper and understand the parables as you read the New Testament yourself. So if you like this content and you like these videos, be sure to subscribe, let other people know about it, and it's always good to give it a thumbs up. Before we get started, let's grab a cup of coffee or some other drink of your particular choice, and we'll jump into the parables. Now, for the past 25 to 30 years, I've been studying and teaching the New Testament at the graduate level in different seminaries and locations around the world. And the goal of this channel is to take that content and material and make it available to a much wider audience. Now, this summer, we're looking at the parables. And I've got a number of them up already, and we're going to keep going through the parables as we go throughout this summer. If you attend a Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, or Presbyterian church, or another church that might use the lectionary series, the month of July, the gospel readings for year A come out of Matthew 13, which is a collection on the parables. So hopefully these videos will help you dive deeper and participate in those readings in a much more meaningful manner. Now, when we went through the Old Testament background, and I'll put a link to the video up over here, and really these links allow you just to click on it and then go to that video. So you can either drop out of this video now and go to it, or you can watch the whole video and then scroll through real quickly till you see me pointing like this and the little tag come up there, and then you can touch it and go to that video that way. But when I looked at the Old Testament background to Jesus' parables, we looked at how in the Hebrew Bible they use this word mashal, which means something is like something else, or to be like something, and how this covered a wide range of literature, from the book of Proverbs to Ezekiel's Allegorical Parables to Nathan rebuking King David. They cover a wide range of literature. And when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in the 1st or 2nd century BC, they used the Greek word parabole to translate this Hebrew word mashal. So when we come to the New Testament, we need to understand that the Greek word parable that's used when it says Jesus told them this parable, it's really defined by its translation off the Hebrew scriptures. So it covers a wide range of literature. So when we say parable, there's just not one literary form or genre, it covers a spectrum. So today what I want to do is go through 5 different types of parables, help you be able to identify them, and also understand some of the significance of the different categories. Now, the first type of parable that I want to discuss is a parable that is very much like a proverbial type saying. And in this sense, it's a lot like something taken straight out of the book of Proverbs. The best example of this is Luke 4:23, where Jesus says, "Surely you will quote to me the proverb, 'Physician, heal thyself.'" Just 3 words, and it's very much like a proverb. In fact, some English translations translate as, "Surely you will quote to me the proverb," but in the Greek there, it's the word parable. Now, this is perhaps the only use of a proverbial type parable in the New Testament. The biggest difference between this parable in Luke 4:23 and, say, for example, the Proverbs, is that in the Proverbs, those sayings are very context independent. So it says, you know, as a dog returns to its vomit. We've got a dog right now that's throwing up, and it's pretty amazing how true that parable is. There's no context. It doesn't tell you if it's a dog in the house, in the yard, working in the sheep pen, if it's a guard dog, who owns it, where it is. It's just very context independent. Luke 4:23, though, is very context dependent. Jesus is teaching in a synagogue. He has claimed that he has fulfilled the words of Isaiah the prophet that he's just read. The people then say, "Isn't this the son of Joseph?" To which Jesus replies, "Surely you will quote to me the parable, 'Physician, heal thyself.'" So there's a lot of context there about this parable, and that helps us understand it. The other thing I want you to realize is in a future video, I'm going to dive into this particular parable itself. So I'm not going to give away all of my gold right now or cast my pearls before swine. I'm just going to mention that it's coming up. So if you want to see more, stay tuned to this channel. The second type of parable is that of a simile. Now, a simile is a genre of literature, and it follows a very specific formula. Something is like or something is as this. So you have an X equals Y type formula. Now, when we looked at the rabbinic background to Jesus' parables, or compared Jesus' parables to those found in the rabbis, and I've got a whole video on that right up over here that you can click on. One of the things that we notice is that when the rabbis taught, they often introduced a parable with this mashal saying, which reads along the lines, "To what will I compare this? It is like," and then they give their story or their parable. The rabbis often used a simile introduction or the grammar of a simile to introduce a parable. The same thing with Jesus' parables. We get these simile introductions to his parables. Now, does that mean they're a simile or not? Well, in order for it to be classified as a simile, I would say you need an X equals Y with the like or the as statement in there. When Jesus says the kingdom of God is like, and then he goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the two sons, the scales are very unequal. So it has a simile introduction, but I wouldn't say it's a simile. About the only parable that I know in the New Testament that really fits the characteristics of a simile is Matthew 13:52, where Jesus says, "Every scribe trained for the kingdom of God is like a householder who brings out of his treasure both old and new things." Now in there, every scribe trained for the kingdom of God is of equal weight to a householder who brings out of his treasure both old and new things. And it's all balanced on this fulcrum of this as or this like statement in the middle there. So I would say that is definitely a simile parable. The rest or other ones I would say are introduced with a simile formula. Third category of parables are that of example stories. Now, before I jump into this, I want to say that my approach here on these 5 categories of parables is very much along the lines of 7 out of 8 dentists recommend. In other words, I've looked at all the different people on how they wrote about the parables, and I've kind of collated that 7 out of 8 of them say that there are proverbs, or there are example stories, or there are allegories, and I've used these as my categories. So the third category, example stories. This is perhaps the most debated category of parables, whether we should consider an example story a parable or not. Now the story that really gets debated here is the story of the rich man and Lazarus who lays at his gate. Rich man goes by him every day, he sees him lying there, and then both die. And when they die, the rich man is in Hades and the poor man is in Abraham's bosom, and a great chasm separates the two. And you know the story there. He asked that, hey, send someone back to warn my family relatives about what's going to happen, that they can change their lives. And Jesus says, they have the law and the prophets. They don't need a person rising from the dead to convince them to change their ways. Now the question is that just a story that's being told, or is it a parable? An example story really functions on the lines of that the characters in the story provide an example for us either to imitate or to reject. In this case, we reject the life of that rich man and the consequences of his life. So I'm going to just throw my 2 cents in there and say I would classify that as a parable. But if we go over to the Gospel of John, in John chapter 10, John chapter 15, we have this story, or Jesus is teaching on the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, and then we have his teaching on the vine in John chapter 15. Now in both those, you have about 5 verses where Jesus just talks about, this is what a shepherd does. He calls his sheep by his name, he follows them, he leads them out to pasture and back in. That's what a shepherd. Here's what it's like to be a vine. The vine gets trimmed, there's the gardener, it gets tended for, and then after both of these, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, or I am the vine, and then applies those examples to himself. Now, I really don't think that they are parables for 2 reasons. First off, there is no challenge to your theology or lifestyle based on these. Rather, they are very, very simple, sort of straightforward comparison type teachings. The second reason why I don't think they are parables is that John calls them paroimai. This is the Greek word that means it is a pithy statement or a figure of speech. It is not the word parable. Now, when John is written, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all been written before him. So he knows and is fully aware that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have used this term, parable, to identify types of Jesus' teaching. He doesn't use that here. He could have easily used the word parable. Instead, he uses this other Greek word, and I think he's letting you know that they're not parables, but they're really sort of figures of speech or little stories that are meant to illustrate a point. Now, if you're interested in learning more about John 10 or John 15, I just so happen to have 2 videos on those passages. So I will put up first the link to John chapter 10, and then when that changes, you can take a look and you can click over to John chapter 15 and see those videos. And I'll also try and put them in the Show More section underneath this video. 4th category of parables are allegories. And surprise, surprise, I have a video on that. In fact, it was the one last week. Are the parables allegories? And I'll put the link up there for you. Allegories function by having a code where elements and aspects of the story parallel over to other points or ideas. So X equals this, Y equals this, Z equals this. Or if we look at the parable of the 4 soils, Jesus teaches the parable and then he gives an allegorical interpretation afterwards. So the seed equals this, the soil on the path equals those who reject the word, Satan comes and eats up the seed, takes it away. The rocky soil equals this, the seed that falls in the thorns is this, and so there's a one-to-one correspondence throughout the whole parable, and that makes it an allegory. But also, when we looked at that parable, I also argued that when Jesus teaches that parable from the boat to the people standing on the countryside, he doesn't give them the allegorical interpretation. He does that to the disciples later on. So he expects the crowd on the countryside to understand it as a story, which is the next category we're going to look at, a narrative type parable. But when he gives it, he really expects them to be able to understand it without that code. It's going to be challenging, but the possibility is there. The other thing I wanted to say in regard to this is that if you're looking at the parables and you're saying, oh, I wonder if that's an allegory or not, one of the surest ways to determine if you've got an allegorical parable is whether there is an allegorical interpretation offered after the parable. Usually it comes right after it, but sometimes it might be a paragraph or 2 later on. If you get an allegorical interpretation, then I say you're on pretty solid ground for interpreting it as an allegory. And finally, we come to the 5th category of parables, and that is a narrative parable, or what some authors will call a parable proper. Now, with a narrative parable, we don't read it like an allegory where you really don't enter into the narrative or the story world. Rather, you're looking for these point-by-point type comparisons as you go through. That's how you unlock an allegorical parable. With a narrative parable, you have to drop into the story and read it and understand it as a narrative. So Nathan, when he goes to see King David and he tells him the story of the rich man who steals the poor man's only sheep and then slaughters it so he can offer hospitality and food to someone who came to visit him, is a good example. David gets caught up in the story before he has a chance to erect any sort of defense, and he exercises judgment. This man deserves to die. And then Nathan turns around with the subversion and he says, you're that man. This is the way a narrative parable works. There's no great sort of like level of allegorical correspondences between them. It's the entire narrative world that's the important thing. Or another way to put this is that you don't get lost in the story of an allegory, but you can get lost in the story of a narrative. And so that's a good way of looking at the difference between the two. Another point to bear in mind with narrative parables or story parables is that we've got two that are very extensive: the Good Samaritan and the parable of the two sons. But other parables can be very, very short. The kingdom of God is like leaven that a woman takes and hides in 50 measures of dough until the whole lump is leavened. Well, there you've got one sentence that creates an entire narrative story, so it doesn't need to be long or extensive, and narrative can really be very, very succinct and short. Now, as I was saying at the beginning, during the month of July, a lot of churches are reading through Matthew 13 in their lectionary readings. And so one of the challenges I have for you is, as you go through those readings, is to look at the parables and then ask yourself, what type of parable is this one? Now, I've already given you a handle on two of them, but as you go through, look at these parables and ask yourself, gee, I wonder what type of parable this one is, or what could that be? Or maybe it has aspects of two. Now, having said all that, what I want to do is just summarize here with some basic traits of Jesus' parables. Now, the first trait is that Jesus' parables are very simple skeletal stories. Even when you have something like the parable of the four soils, you have a sower, he goes out to sow and some seed falls. Is this sower rich or poor? We don't know that as well. What was he sowing? What type of seed? We're not told that. It's just very skeletal in its details. And it's this brevity, which a lot of times I think gives the artistry and the majesty to these parables. Another trait of Jesus' parables is that he argues from lesser to greater. Perhaps the best example of this is the parable of the mustard seed. This entirely insignificant, small little seed, so tiny you can barely see it, but that's being used to explain the kingdom of God. So you're going from this almost microscopic thing to this eternal and all-encompassing and omnipresent kingdom of God. So parables often go from lesser to greater. If this is the case with this, it's so much greater over here in the kingdom of God. And then finally, in the video on comparing Jesus' parables with that of the rabbis, one of the points I brought out is that in the rabbinic use of parables, they are almost always used to reinforce good orthodox theology or practices. Jesus' parables, on the other hand, are often meant to subvert or undermine preconceptions or theological ideas that had ossified in that person's belief system. They are meant to break things up and help you see new perspectives. And so in this context, the parables are really designed to subvert our thought. John Dominic Cruzan writes that myth establishes a world, satire critiques a world, parables subvert a world. Or Anthony Thistleton writes, and I'm going to read it here for you, a parable projects a world which is at first familiar to the hearer, in which the hearer is at home. It draws the hearer in as a participant rather than a spectator. So you can see what he's talking about here is that a good parable will let the person enter it. So the metaphors and the literary devices used in the parable are not just there for figurative or decorative purposes. They're designed to communicate and to draw us in. He continues by writing, as the reader is enthralled and drawn along, he or she arrives at a place where a further action occurs, an act which surprises or reverses the reader's prior expectations. the parable world diverges so drastically from the reader's own that it constitutes a challenge, and the reader has to go along or to reject it. When we look at the parable of the four soils, one of the things that we notice in the parable of the four soils is right at the very start, he says that a sower goes out to sow, and as he's sowing his seed, they're going, okay, we understand all this so far. He sows some of the seed on the road, and then he throws some in the rocks, and then he throws some in the weeds. They'd be going, this is the stupidest farmer I've ever heard about in my whole life. This guy is going to starve to death because only one out of every 4 of his seeds actually ends up in soil that has a chance of bearing some crop. So it has this very provocative and challenging start where you're going, I'm not sure I agree with this parable at all, or this teacher. So, by way of closing, I hope these 5 categories of parables help you understand the parables. That they can be proverbs, that they can be similes, they can be example stories, they can be allegories, or they can be parable propers or narrative parables. And once again, there's nothing special about those categories. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and let other people know about it. If you want to see more, click on this link down here. This will take you to a playlist on all my videos on biblical text. If you want to look specifically at videos on the parables, click on this one up here. And as time goes along, more videos will be added to that playlist as well. Until next week, peace.